I think the great secret is that the scripts were very good, and they were very good, I think, for two reasons. One is, for a start, that there was an awful lot in them. The average BBC half hour, 65 pages. Fawlty Towers, we used to do 135 to 140 pages. We literally did twice as many. Camera cuts, average shows got 200. We used to have 400 camera cuts. So there was an enormous amount in there. The other thing is they were very well constructed, and what Connie and I discovered worked for us was that we never really started to write the dialogue until we got the plot worked out. So we would spend sometimes as much as 2.5 weeks on a plot. Not always the same one, because if we got stuck, we'd sometimes put it to one side and pick up another one that we were halfway through and try and run with that. But we never really bothered to write the dialogue, as I say, until we'd really got the story worked out in considerable detail. You always have to change it a bit, because you can never visualize it all when you've just got the storyline there, and you'll find that one scene that you'd imagine doesn't work because Basil comes into it in a different frame of mind or in a different mood from what you need. So you're always having to rejig it a bit. But that was the key. We never started until we had the story, so we always knew where we were going. Some people try to write comedy by starting scene one and they start writing the dialogue. Well, the chances of them getting to a satisfactory ending are 1 in 100. You've got to kind of know where you're going while you're building the thing. One of the characteristics of those episodes is that there's always one key idea. But what we often tried to do along with that key idea was to have one or two other subplots, other threads running. And they would run parallel for a time, and then hopefully they would become intertwined. And by the end, the last 5 minutes, they would all come together. That's what we managed to do in the best of the episodes. But the most useful thing we used to do was to ask people for ideas, people who were in the business. For example, Connie and I were on holiday in Monte Carlo for 2 weeks, and we met a very nice woman who was just sort of helping us with the hotel, and we had coffee with her. And we said to her, what's the most difficult kind of guest that you have? And she described Mrs. Richards absolutely perfectly. And we wrote it all down, the fact that they always complain about everything, but they don't want it changed. They just want a reduction. And this business of strategic deafness, hearing what they want to hear. And she just gave us a character portrait. Another time I said to a great friend of mine called Andrew Lehman, who was a restaurateur, I said, what was the worst problem you had when you used to work at the Savoy Hotel? And he said, oh, the stiffs. I said, what? He said, oh, getting rid of the stiffs. I said, well, what do you mean people died a lot? Oh, he said, oh, a lot. He said, the old dears, I'm afraid they know the Savoy will always treat them really well and do these things, so they would sometimes check in with a bottle of pills, take them in the night. In the morning, Savoy staff would walk in, pick up the pills, say, we got another one. And then the problem was getting the stiffs into the service elevator without alarming the other guests. Well, once you've been given that as an idea, I mean, it's just wonderful. And then you put a doctor in the hotel, and it's a kind of a joy. Some of those worked out very well. It's interesting because sometimes we had a wonderful ending for the dead body when we couldn't use it. The guy who died and who, gets put in the basket and all that stuff, we thought it would be terribly funny if we'd established without Basil knowing that he had a twin brother. So that after Basil had finally got him in the basket, the twin brother would walk in and come up to the desk, and Basil would abuse him. This mindless practical joke. And we couldn't do it because there was no way of Basil telling the twin that his brother was dead. You couldn't do that in a comedy show. You see what I mean? So it was a great shame. It would have been too difficult mixing that kind of emotion. Timing is all important, and the hardest thing is to get it well enough rehearsed. Now, 5 days was never really enough, plus the day in the studio, to get it right. And what happened was that we did anything between 20 and 25 hours editing on each show. Almost every minute you see up on the screen, we spent 1 hour editing. And it was only by doing that you could just tighten it up and just tighten it there and take out a line of dialogue there and sometimes take out a repetition there or then lose 2 lines of dialogue there. That's what really got the pace on it. And there wasn't time to get it that good in terms of just the rehearsal period and the studio recording. It felt to me very much like a team, because in the first series, John Howard Davis, second series, Bobby Spears, and Prue, and Andrew and Connie and I listened to each other a great deal. And people, if I was doing a scene with, let's say, with Sybil, with Prue, then Connie and Andrew would just sit there watching, and after a time, Andrew might say, what about that? Or that isn't quite working. But because Connie and I had written and then rewritten the scripts, there wasn't an enormous amount of script rewriting. They were more or less right most of the time. But how we did them was very much a cooperative thing with lots of suggestions coming in. And I just did an American show, Third Rock from the Sun, and it was lovely. It was just like Fawlty Towers again, with about 6 key people giving ideas, and nobody bothering whether their idea was accepted or not. It was just that sense of making it as good as possible. All the BBC shows at that time were always recorded with a live audience, and it was kind of understood that you didn't use any kind of sweetening, you didn't use any kind of canned laughter. We did sometimes, and I'll tell you what we did. Occasionally you'd have something on film, and the audience would of course have to watch that on the monitors, and then that would cut back to the studio, and the audience would still be watching the monitors, and they would fail to see that we were supposed to be back in the studio. And sometimes you would find that there would be a complete silence after a joke because the audience is looking in the wrong place, or they're still looking in the studio when they should be looking up the monitor. And then we used to take one of our own laughs off the soundtrack and put it in the place if it needed it. But I said to the actors very early on, I had a theory about this. I said, we're not going to play this at the pace of the studio audience. I said, we don't have to. In the theatre, you have to go at the pace of the audience because they can't hear you otherwise. You have to wait for that laughter to curve, the laughter curve to come down. Then you start speaking again. But in television, you have this wonderful thing called a microphone that's there. And if you talk into the mic while the audience is still laughing, then the wonderful thing is that people at home can hear it. So you can keep the pace up. And when people are watching at home, there's only 1 or 2 of them. It's not like being in an audience in a theatre, so they don't laugh as much. So what you have to do is play it faster when people are, at home in 1s and 2s than you ever would if you were doing it in front of a full audience. So we deliberately ignored the studio audience and tried to play it faster than was right for the studio audience in order to get the sufficiently rapid pace of the people at home. The second show that we did, which was about the builders, was performed almost entirely to complete silence. And it was not a very comfortable experience. And afterwards, I was a bit disturbed. And people said, no, it was a funny show. Actually, I think it's the least good of the 10 shows, or 12 shows. But, they said, no, it was fine, it was funny. I said, well, what about the audience? And they said, well, we don't know. We found out later that a large number of people from the Icelandic Broadcasting Corporation had visited the BBC that day. And the BBC were always helpful to shows like mine. Thought, wouldn't it be nice if we put all 70 of them in the front row? And they sat there being very pleasant and charming and Icelandic and not laughing at all, just this faint whiff of cod coming from the front row, which had we recognised might have given us the explanation. And I've got to say, it was a pretty tough recording, and it needs quite a lot of editing to tighten it up. Fawlty Towers took a little time to get started. It didn't pick up a very big audience the first series. It's suddenly on the repeats. You got the impression something was happening, some kind of groundswell of approval was happening. The critics began to quite like it towards the end of the first series. And after that, on the whole, the criticisms were very good. But Connie and I found doing the second series probably as difficult as anything we'd done, because the hardest thing in this business is to deal with unreal expectations. I mean, the problem with Fierce Creatures was not Fierce Creatures. The problem with Fierce Creatures was Fish Called Wanda. People thought not only that it was going to be as funny, which is unlikely because at the time it was arguably as successful as any British film ever made, so lightning was not likely to strike in the same place twice. But there was also a feeling it would be in the same style, and because it was not in the same style, people couldn't see what style it was in. Now, the problem we had with the second series of Fawlty Towers is that the expectation was unreasonably high, because I realized that people were already remembering the first series as better than it was. Because if there's 3 or 4 things in the first series that are really funny, the audience remembers that as the kind of general standard rather than the highlights. Then they expect the second series to be at the highlight level all the way through. So it was a huge effort to get those scripts as good as I think they finally were. About 6 weeks each. If you think about Fast, because of the high level of energy, the kind of mania involved, people have to get very wound up, and it's easier to do that in the context of subjects that make people particularly anxious, which usually means taboo. So if you look at a lot of the Fawlty Towers episodes, you'll find that one's about dead bodies, one's about rats, which people are like that about. One's about a woman who pretends that she's deaf. It's a little bit dodgy here and there. There's a lot of taboo in there. And anybody in comedy knows that if you get into taboo areas, if it's done right, 2 things happen which are both good. One is that you're exploring something that is a little unfamiliar and a little dangerous and a little exciting and therefore a little bit interesting. And secondly, it arouses a degree of anxiety, which means that people laugh more. I mean, the basis of sexual jokes, 99% of which are not the slightest bit funny, is that they harness people's anxiety and embarrassment about sex so that they get big laughs. As I say, very few of them I think are actually funny. In the whole 12 episodes, there are only 2 jokes the BBC ever objected to. I think Bill Cotton was worried about 2. One had already been cut. And the other one I was very unsure about. I think it was a reference to one of the concentration camps, just when Basil was getting very confused. The word popped up, and I was not very sure about it myself. And when Bill said, I'm worried about that, I just cut it. But we didn't have any pressure, and the PC lobby, the politically correct lobby, is something I don't understand, because a lot of what I see on television now, both here in America, seems to me much riskier than we would have got away with even in the Python days. And then at the same time, you hear about these politically correct movements, which I think are by and large run and staffed largely by obsessionals. There's a good idea at the back of political correctness, but it gets taken ad absurdum. And I think that the danger is this: if you're in a group of people and you find that one person is particularly touchy, they have difficulty controlling their emotions, greater difficulty than the other people in the group, then you can't have so much fun about them because they're touchy and they're likely to explode. So when they're around, you're not as relaxed, you're not as spontaneous, you can't be more real, you have to kind of be more formal. Now, if you find that society is being run by the touchiest members, then in a sense that's a bit sick, because you're trying to take as the general standard the standard of the people who have the greatest problem controlling their emotions in that area. In that anniversary program, Basil actually is thinking of someone else for a short period of time before the panic overtakes him. And you do get the impression that there is something positive underneath all the other stuff between him and Sybil. And Connie and I particularly liked that episode because we felt that we were beginning to explore character a little bit more. It was a little less farcical. I remember we thought it was a little bit more in the area of Alan Ayckbourn, whom we both adored. And we liked that episode a lot, and the great joy of it was we had much longer to rehearse it than we normally did, because we got about 5 days into rehearsal, and a splendid thing happened. A BBC executive got into a argument with a rigger, someone who puts the lights up, and eventually punched him. And the unions went on strike, and we couldn't record the program on the ordinary day, and it was postponed. They settled the strike, and everything was put off a week. And Julian Holloway was unable to do the second week because he had another commitment, and we brought in dear Ken Campbell, whom I've always adored. He's such a marvellous, strange, funny man. So he was the only one who was new, and we had all this time to rehearse it, and it was really, really good because everyone was able to get familiar with the show and then bring little things to it. So it's I think it's one of the very best episodes. I watched Basil the Rat last Sunday as part of a sort of fundraising thing, and I was very, very pleased with it. There's a particular scene at the end when he and Manuel are talking to a young couple, and they're really not taking in anything the young couple is saying. They're just trying to see where the rat is. And I thought it was extraordinarily funny, and yet I couldn't explain quite why I found it so funny. And I love the denouement, the way that we finally get Polly presenting the box of biscuits. There's the little rat there looking at the inspector. And Basil actually says, "Would you care for a rat? Because what else do you say there?" So, and the actor, damn, I forgot his name, he's so good, who just looks at the rat and absolutely doesn't believe it. He knows it's not there, although he could see it. And he plays that so well. And then right at the end, you see Basil being dragged out. I'm very, very fond of that episode because, again, there's quite a lot in it. And there's some very good lines early on. I love when Manuel, of course, thinks that it's a filigree Siberian hamster, and Basil persuades him it's a rat. He said, "Don't you have rats?" He said, "Don't you have rats?" He said, "Oh, did Franco have them all shot?" That's one of my favourite lines. When we started writing The Kipper and the Corpse, we started with the idea of getting rid of a dead body. And I was fascinated by the idea of trying to get Basil very happy about the fact someone had died. So we came up with the idea that he thought he'd poisoned him, and then when he discovered he hadn't poisoned him, he'd be really happy, and then the doctor could walk in when he was around shouting, "I'm so happy, I'm so happy." Again, utter ruthless selfishness. No thought for this guy or his family at all. It's just, is he on the hook or is he off the hook? As I say, he's a terrible man.